The great stress that Jesus faced. Many people think that the road to the cross was easy for Jesus. If the decision were easy, the value of Jesus' sacrifice would be diminished. We read that Jesus was overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Imagine this. You were about to go through one of the most painful deaths a person can experience. There will be humiliation and insults thrown at you, and the people coming to arrest you are coming soon. The book of Luke tells the story of Jesus' final journey to his death. From his prayer in Gethsemane, where his faith in God is confirmed, to his burial, the Bible describes how an innocent man came to die for others. The Gospels each include a narrative that describes the time that Jesus, his disciples, and others spent in the Garden of Gethsemane, just before Jesus was arrested. Jesus prayed to his Father in the garden 3 times, saying, "And after going a little farther, he fell face down and prayed, saying, 'My Father, if it is possible that is consistent with your will, let this cup pass from me, yet not as I will, but as you will.'" Matthew 26, verse 39, Amplified Bible. A little later, Jesus prays. He went away a second time and prayed, saying, "My Father, if this cannot pass away unless I drink it, yours will be done." Matthew 26, verse 42. These prayers shed light on Jesus' state of mind immediately prior to his crucifixion and demonstrate his complete surrender to the will of God. The cup that Jesus is referring to is the suffering that was going to befall him in the future. It is as if Jesus were being presented with a cup that was full of bitterness, and it was expected of him to drink the entire thing. In Matthew 20, verse 22, Jesus talked about suffering. But Jesus replied, "You do not realize what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup of suffering that I am about to drink?" They answered, "We are able." Matthew 20, verse 22. When Jesus prays to the Father, "Let this cup pass from me," he is expressing the natural human desire to avoid pain and suffering. Jesus is fully God, but he is also fully human. Though perfect, his human nature still struggled with the need to accept the torture and shame that awaited him. His flesh recoiled from the cross. In the same context, Jesus tells his disciples the following: "Keep actively watching and praying that you may not come into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the body is weak." Matthew 26, verse 41. When Jesus prayed, "Let this cup pass from me," he was fighting against the desires of his flesh, which yearned for self-preservation and comfort. The struggle was fierce, overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Then he said to them, "My soul is deeply grieved, so that I am almost dying of sorrow. Stay here and stay awake and keep watch with me." Matthew 26, verse 38. This prayer, more than anything else, demonstrates that Jesus was in every way fully human. Jesus had foreknowledge of what was to come. Mark 8, verse 31, Amplified Bible. "And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must of necessity suffer many things and be rejected as the Messiah by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and must be put to death, and after 3 days rise from death to life." The torment that he was going to go through was going to be more than just physical. It was also going to be mental and spiritual. Jesus was aware that it was God's plan for him to be crucified, that God wanted him to be pierced for our transgressions and wounded for our healing. Jesus knew that this was the will of God. Isaiah 53 verses 5 to 7. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was crushed for our wickedness, our sin, our injustice, our wrongdoing. The punishment required for our well-being fell on him, and by his stripes, wounds, we are healed. All of us, like sheep, have gone astray. We have turned each one to his own way, but the Lord has caused the wickedness of us all, our sin, our injustice, our wrongdoing, to fall on him instead of us. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth to complain or defend himself. Like a lamb that is led to slaughter, and like a sheep that is silent before her shearers, so he did not open his mouth. Jesus loves mankind, but his humanity dreaded the pain and sorrow he faced, and it drove him to ask his Father, "Let this cup pass from me." The phrase, "let this cup pass from me," appears in Jesus' prayer, and it contains two significant qualifications. To begin, he utters the prayer, "if it is possible." Jesus implores his Father to let him choose an alternative path to redemption for humankind, if one exists. Jesus did not want to die, but he did follow the will of God. The events that occurred after he prayed demonstrate that there was no other way. The sacrifice of Jesus Christ is the only one that could possibly redeem the world. John 1 verse 29. The next day he saw Jesus coming to him and said, "Look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." Revelation 5 verse 9. And they sang a new song of glorious redemption, saying, "Worthy and deserving are you to take the scroll and to break its seals, for you were slain, sacrificed, and with your blood you purchased people for God from every tribe and language and people and nation." Second, Jesus prays, "Yet not as I will, but as you will." Jesus was committed to the will of God, body, mind, and soul. The prayer of the righteous is always dependent on the will of God. Matthew 6, verse 10, Amplified Bible. "Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven." In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus conquered the flesh and kept it in subjection to the Spirit. He accomplished this by submitting himself wholeheartedly and fervently to the will of God. When we go through difficult times, it is comforting to know that Jesus understands what it's like to want God's will and yet to not want it, to desire righteousness and obedience, even when the flesh is screaming out against it. This conflict is not sinful. It is a normal part of being human. Our Redeemer fully embodied human nature in every respect. Hebrews 2 verse 17. Therefore it was essential that he had to be made like his brothers, mankind, in every respect, so that he might, by experience, become a merciful and faithful high priest in things related to God, to make atonement, propitiation, for the people's sins, thereby wiping away the sin, satisfying divine justice, and providing a way of reconciliation between God and mankind. He had come to seek and to save the lost, and he was successful in completing his mission, despite the fact that it required him to drink from the cup of suffering until the very end. His openness in prayer demonstrates the depth and quality of his relationship with the Father. It was very tough. The disciples underestimate the gravity of the situation, and they fall asleep. Luke 22 verses 43 to 45. Now an angel appeared to him from heaven, strengthening him, and being in agony, deeply distressed and anguished almost to the point of death, he prayed more intently, and his sweat became like drops of blood falling down on the ground. When he rose from prayer, He came to the disciples and found them sleeping from sorrow, and he said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Get up and pray that you may not fall into temptation." An angel appears to comfort him. The significance of the angelic appearance is that it demonstrates heaven's willingness to stand by Jesus as he faces his calling. As he faces rejection and death, Jesus lays his burdens before God. This is a very human portrait of Jesus as he faces his death with a range of emotions. Luke's portrait of Jesus does not conceal his divinity. He portrays Jesus as someone who can relate to our flaws and traumas. Hebrews 4, verse 15, Amplified Bible. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize and understand our weaknesses and temptations, but one who has been tempted, knowing exactly how it feels to be human in every respect as we are, yet without committing any sin. This text reveals something about Jesus' character while demonstrating how we can face the great trials of life that God sends us. These verses show a man who is reliant on God and determined to do his will. We see a person who faces adversity by turning to God and another who expresses his intense emotions to God in prayer. Jesus is not spared the trial, but what is supplied is the strength to face it. Though he does not hesitate to ask if another way can be found, he affirms his determination to follow God's will. Heaven responds by giving Jesus the strength to face what God has called him to do, not by granting his request for another way. The passage revolves around this union of submission to the divine call and divine strength supplied. This passage reveals exemplary points about Jesus' character as he faces the cross trial. In prayer, Jesus expresses both his pain and his need to God. His custom of communicating with God is unaffected by the unusual events that occur in his life. We frequently neglect to go to God with our needs when we are the busiest. Trials frequently bring us to our knees, but the hectic pace of life frequently keeps us on the move and prevents us from praying. That is not true of Jesus. His pattern reminds us that prayer is essential even in the midst of chaos. And his prayer is not just to check in, it is full of honesty, emotion, and pain. True prayer necessitates effort. Too often, rather than laboring in prayer, we bow our heads, close our eyes, and let our minds wander. In prayer, Jesus demonstrates honesty and humility. He sincerely hopes that God will not force him to go through what is ahead of him, and shares this openly, but he is even more committed to doing God's will. The prayer, while distinct from the laments in Psalms, is similar in that the petitioners also expressed their deepest emotions and pain to God. The private confrontation that occurs in prayer frequently produces the solace we require to take our next steps while holding God's hand. Furthermore, prayer is not a haphazard activity. As he seeks God in the midst of his situation, Jesus prays with his entire being. He even sweats blood drops. Jesus can walk with God because he seeks God on a regular basis. It is interesting that Luke, a physician, would bring up this unusual medical condition. Hematidrosis is a rare condition. The current understanding is that when someone is stressed, tiny capillaries within sweat glands rupture, allowing blood to mix with sweat. As explained by Dr. Frederick Zugerby, around the sweat glands there are multiple blood vessels in a net-like form. Under the pressure of great stress, the vessels constrict. Then, as the anxiety passes, the blood vessels dilate to the point of rupture. The blood goes into the sweat glands. As the sweat glands are producing a lot of sweat, it pushes the blood to the surface, coming out as droplets of blood mixed with sweat. This certainly describes Jesus' situation in the garden, but there is one tricky word in the Greek which should give us a bit of pause. The text says that his sweat became hosei, great drops of blood. Jesus in Gethsemane and his agony is the main point of the narrative. When Jesus arrives in the garden, he tells his disciples that he is deeply troubled and distressed. He is overcome with grief to the point of death. Luke captures this by referring to sweat as if it were drops of blood. Why is he overcome right now? His pain was not simple but rather complex. We can only begin to comprehend his agony by remembering that he had to bear the penalty that sin deserved for millions upon millions of people. In the garden, Jesus' humanity is fully revealed. We see Jesus in his, dare I say, most vulnerable moment. He remains sinless, yet he is now experiencing the fullness of what it truly means to be human. It is here that he will experience our grief. It is here that he will experience stronger temptation than any of us. So it is fitting to say that he was tempted in every way. And it is the view into the cup that causes Christ to pray, "If it is possible, take this cup from me." He appeals. Silence. He appeals a second time. Silence. He appeals a third time. Silence. This silence lets us know that this was God's will. Jesus is mocked on the cross with taunts. His death, as unjust as it is, appears to be a defeat on the surface. But because of who he is, Jesus transforms it into victory, not just for himself, but for all who accept what he accomplished on a solitary piece of wood one Palestinian afternoon. Every leader feels alone at times, especially when venturing into new territory. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus experienced one of his most lonely moments. Every member of his team deserted him just hours before he was to be tried, tortured, and crucified. His story in the garden is one of history's most potent examples of a leader's dedication. Every leader who does something significant for God has a Gethsemane experience. What can we learn from this lonely time? Gethsemane is the location where, number 1, spiritual battles occur. Number 2, loneliness is felt. Number 3, honesty is expressed. Number 4, submission is required. Number 5, strength is received. Why is this verse important for us to understand? We need to comprehend the solitude and the grief of Gethsemane because it helps us to understand the accomplishment of Gethsemane. Some have seen a relation between bloody sweat on the brow of Jesus with the curse of Adam, who would toil by the sweat of his brow. Adam failed the garden test. The forbidden fruit was a burden he could not bear. He stumbled, and humanity was born as wrathful children from that point forward. However, Christ, the greater Adam, triumphed in the garden where Adam failed. The blood of Christ combines with Adam's sweat. He took the curse upon himself. That is why we are to witness Christ's anguish in the garden, because he could not let go of the cup, and he drank it all the way to the bottom. It means that there will be no more wrath directed at those united to Christ. He drank it instead of us. If he drinks it all, there will be none left for us. Yes, this was accomplished at Golgotha, but the obedience demonstrated in Gethsemane was also instrumental in removing the curse from us. His complete compliance at this time has been transferred to our account. This also lets us know that Jesus understands how it feels to be alone. He comprehends pain, He understands pain. We express our distress to him. He comprehends. He has faced more temptation than any of us will ever face. He willingly and knowingly looked into the cup and drank it to the last drop. We can entrust our pain to him. Have you ever had doubts about God's love for you? Take a look at the Garden of Gethsemane. You can see the Son of God sweating profusely, like drops of blood, or perhaps sweat mixed with blood. And you can see his determination to not only obey the Father, but to obey the Father in redeeming humanity. He drank from the cup in your honor. Look no further than the Father's silence. There was no other way to redeem humanity because his wrath would be poured out on his Son. Allow the logic of Romans 8 verse 32 to motivate you. He who did not spare his own Son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? If God had not been committed to your redemption, he would have let that cup pass from Jesus in the garden and transferred it to us instead. He would have let humanity be swallowed up by his wrath while preserving his Son. He, however, did not. Not only because he loves us, but also because this is who God is. It is in his nature to be self-giving, to give of himself so that others may live. You can have faith in this. Who can be against you if God is on your side?